Hello, welcome to the latest Noir series of short author interviews with authors that we like. My name is Nick Quantrill. I'm one of the festival's co-directors and author of the Joe Garrity series. My guest today is Matthew Richardson. Matthew is the author of the Solomon Vine series of espionage novels. The first one, My Name is Nobody, was published in 2017, and the latest, The Insider, which I have a copy of here, is published 25th of November by Penguin. And as well as writing thrillers, Matthew has worked as a freelance journalist, a speechwriter and researcher in Westminster, and as a screenwriter. So some good insider knowledge there, I think, Matthew. We'll maybe get stuck.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah.
So yeah, The Insider is the second Solomon Vine novel. I think it very much stands alone from the first one as well, which is interesting. But let's just talk a little about the novel first. I mean, Solomon, when we meet him at the beginning of the novel again, he's kind of out of the game, isn't he, effectively? He's kind of drifting a little bit, but he receives a late night call telling him to report to the Cabinet Office. So I'll let you explain a little bit about the plot so I don't give too much away to the listeners.
No, sure. So yeah, we meet him quite a few years after the end of My Name's Nobody, which was the first Solomon Vine book, and that ended in explosive circumstances, metaphorically and literally. Yeah, so we meet him in The Insider when he's been out of MI6 for a number of years, but he's got a sort of odd jobs consultancy sort of role investigating matters of national security, and so he gets called up in the middle of the night occasionally by the Cabinet Office and briefed on sort of various secret matters, and then is a bit of a sort of lone ranger to go and conduct the investigation. So that's what we have at the start. A prominent Russian billionaire and defector has been found dead in a London hotel, and basically he's been unbeknownst to the world working for the British for a number of years, but he's been rather unusually working for the British outside the usual sort of spy parameters. So he's not been reporting to a sort of MI6 handler. He's been reporting directly to the top brass. So there's only 4 people in Whitehall who know he has defected, and therefore the fact he's been killed or brutally executed suggests one of them has leaked that information. So Vine is on a sort of Tinker Tailor soldier spy type mole hunt to figure out which of these 4 very important people has been talking out of turn and potentially betraying their country.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that you pick on those 4 suspects. Is that kind of is that a deliberate kind of decision to set up a kind of like a classic whodunit? Because as you say, there can only be 4 suspects. It tells a bit about the 4 suspects because they're all kind of very kind of interesting and powerful in their own way, aren't they?
They are. So it came about really because I wanted to write about the sort of world in which I'd worked in Whitehall, and these sort of very powerful figures who are behind the scenes and don't always make it onto the sort of newspaper front pages. So we know a lot about the politicians, but we don't know much about these very senior civil servants, generals, and the like. So the 4 different suspects are the Chief of the Defence Staff, who obviously is head of the entire British Armed Forces and a hugely powerful and important figure. The Cabinet Secretary at Downing Street, who again is the most senior civil servant and the person who basically runs the entire machinery of government. We've got the Permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office, who is head of the diplomatic service and in charge of all the British embassies across the world, and the sort of Britain beyond our borders. And then the 4th suspect is the chief of MI6 or SIS, who obviously is in charge of, has a very similar role to Permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office, but on the secret side. So these are the 4 most powerful figures in Whitehall. Effectively, they run the entire country. They're privy to all the most classified secrets, and the Russian defector, who's dead at the start of the novel, reports to all of them. So each of them has their own area of own specialism, and this Russian defector provides absolute top level sort of ultra classified information on all these various aspects of national security.
Yeah, fantastic. And is this where your Westminster background kind of pays dividends as a fiction writer? Because it rings very true to me, these four characters. You know, they were kind of almost roles that I had to kind of Google to really kind of understand what these people do, because it is a very, like you say, it's a very shadowy kind of world, isn't it, that they operate in. And you know, so they're not at the front of the stage, are they, when we put the news on and when we kind of pick up newspapers. So yeah, is that kind of that's your kind of specialism, if you like?
Yeah, but, I mean, yes, it is that. I mean, Westminster's a very funny place, really. It looks huge when you see it on the news, and you know, the Houses of Parliament and Whitehall and this sort of big sort of centre of national government. The bizarre thing when you work in it is it's actually incredibly small. People talk about the Westminster Village, and it does have a very village-like mentality. And so I wanted, in both books, I wanted to dramatise that and dramatise who the key figures within that world are. And I'm fascinated by, well, as a spy novelist, by people who hold great power but basically exist almost in secret. And these four figures, though they're publicly avowed and people can find out who they are, they don't do any media, they don't do any speeches. They're very much secret figures, if you like, in that sense. And I was fascinated, having seen them operate when I was a speechwriter, and seen how much power they command, to try and bring that out in the novel and explore that a bit more, which was one of the great attractions of the idea.
Yeah, and I think it really kind of increases the stakes of the novel as well, doesn't it? Which is kind of something that really drives these type of espionage thrillers, isn't it? That sense of, you know, the ultimate kind of chaos that can come about if these people aren't stopped. You know, these are, you know, we're talking, this is the seat of power, isn't it? Really, kind of, it's a global issue, even though it's very much kind of a London novel, isn't it? Essentially, it's a global novel as well, I think.
It is, yes, and it's looking at sort of big world events, but through the prism of this Westminster Village. And I think also what I try to bring out in the novel is, especially in the digital age, how easy it is to betray secrets. It's you know, before Kim Philby and other traitors needed to somehow cart off great paper files with, you know, stuff them into their briefcases or something. Whereas nowadays you could contain tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of secrets on, you know, a USB stick that's you could fit in your pocket. So the methods of betrayal are completely different now. And in some ways, that's what makes it so interesting. I mean, we described it as a whodunit. I think when I wrote it, I thought of it also as a whydunit. I mean, it's difficult if you've only got a limited number of suspects to pull off the classic whodunit formula, where you usually need more like 10 or 15 suspects to really do that. So, and what I was fascinated by was the example of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, obviously Le Carre's most famous book, where you do get a sense perhaps of who the mole is quite early on. It's not a massive shock at the end who it is, but what you're much more doing is exploring why that person's done it, what are the circumstances of their betrayal. And in terms of psychologically, that's what I think I was attempting to do here. It's not an Agatha Christie style whodunit where it's a complete rug pulling surprise at the end. It's more of a psychological exploration of how someone commits treachery at the top level, and looking at why they might have done so.
Yeah, although I think, to be fair, there is a very neat twist towards it, where, you know, it kind of it wrong-footed me as to who's done it. You know, yes. Kind of, you can't kid a kid, can you, generally? So I think, yeah, I would say, well, that was tremendous. So yeah, I won't kind of be there on the elements of it.
Hopefully, it works on the whodunit surface, but also for the very skilled sort of, you know, avid thriller readers who can spot a mole at 50 paces. Hopefully they also get an added layer of sort of whodunit psychological insight. So hopefully both those things work in parallel.
I think they do. So let's talk a little bit about Solomon Vine then, as the protagonist in the story. He's in his 40s, isn't he? So kind of, was that a deliberate choice to kind of make him young enough to be still kind of physically active, but also old enough to have that kind of experience and backstory that kind of leads him to where he is now in his life?
Yeah, it was also, when I started writing the first book, My Name's Nobody, I was fascinated at looking at an intelligence officer whose experience had been post 9/11, really, whose entire world view had sort of been changed by that moment, and the course of their career had been in a post 9/11 world. And so age-wise, that fitted with Vine sort of entering the service in his early 20s after that had happened. And I wanted him to be senior enough where he could be sort of privy to huge secrets and have some sort of power and a huge amount to lose on a personal scale, but not so senior that he was, you know, in the House of Lords or something. So that was partly the reason for choosing that age, and it gave him a long sort of runway in terms of future books. You know, he's got many years of working life ahead of him and lots of interesting things to do with it. So it was, it just felt like the right moment in his life to get the most drama out of it.
Yeah, no, and there's a nice quote in the book where it says, "Danger is the drug of any spy," and I think that kind of, you know, that sense of danger that envelopes him throughout the novel, and his resourcefulness to respond to that is kind of what defines him, isn't it, really? And I really like there's a quote from McCarran on the front cover, which if I just look at my copy says, it's kind of bang up to date, but told with old school panache, and I think that's kind of like a fair summary, isn't it? Yeah, that sort. I mean, if Mick says that, then I'm going to disagree with Mick.
Yeah, that was a great quote. That was the best one I got. I think that was, but I mean that was exactly what I was trying to do. I mean, I didn't want to do a fully historical novel which just sort of retreaded the Le Carré territory, because in the end, I mean, you know, you're not going to do better than the master himself. But so what it was trying to do was take the ingredients of that classic spy novel that hasn't really been bettered, I don't think, certainly not within the English tradition of spy writing, which is, you know, arguably quite distinct from the much more action-packed sort of shoot-'em-up American spy novels. So I wanted to try and take that sort of DNA of the English spy novel, but then make it new again for our age and our times. And I started out with My Name Is Nobody, The Insider continues that. And I mean, it's tricky to do because mobile phones and laptops and the internet are not the spy writer's friend, because they're all sort of arrows at the heart of secrecy, really. I mean, it just almost everything ends up getting exposed. But part of the fun of it is trying to find how you can still use the same devices and plots, deceptions, and all those various tricks in a digital world. And the challenge of that is in some ways the fun of writing these sorts of novels.
Yeah, I guess it's pros and cons with technology, isn't it? Because it does kind of give someone like Solomon Vine more tools to play with, doesn't it? I suppose in the novel, it's not just drawback. I don't think. I think it's an interesting kind of option as you have as the author, I think, as well.
Yes, and I mean, Solomon Vine's sort of special gift or power, if you like, isn't his fighting ability or his sort of Jack Reacher tough guy persona. It's very much his brain. That's his key skill. He's a sort of code breaker, a mathematician, someone who loves solving puzzles. And I mean, this book, particularly The Insider, gets very much into his head. It's very much sort of looking at how you decode these things through his eyes, and that was and using technology but also analog methods, and how a spy would actually do that in today's world. And so yeah, no, technology certainly makes it more interesting and yeah, more of a challenge but more enjoyable to write.
Yeah, excellent. And let's talk a little bit about the research behind the novel then, because it does touch on real life cases, doesn't it? The cases of British Stasi spies, where fact and fiction starts to blur in this novel, I think, doesn't it? So would you like to kind of say something about that before I go blabbing my mouth and saying too much?
Yeah, no, well, absolutely. That was the fun of this. And I didn't do that so much with My Name Is Nobody, but with The Insider, it wasn't necessarily pre-planned, just that the shape of the story required events to have taken place back in the Cold War, which would have ramifications for today's world, and the mole in question would have been recruited just towards the end of the Cold War. So I sort of started delving into that area, which I hadn't really looked at a huge amount. I mean, I wasn't alive when the Cold War was on, and for the first book, certainly I'd been quite conscious of not referencing the Cold War too much, trying to make it, I guess I said, make it new and relevant and contemporary. But having done that in the first one, I thought with this one, it was a fun chance to explore the Cold War world a bit more, weave the sort of real life spy history into the book and play around with that, which is one of the great joys of it. I mean, Robert Harris is one of my key inspirations in terms of why I write thrillers, and of course he's the absolute master of doing that. So yeah, it's got a bit of that in there, and that was great fun.
Excellent. And we also brush up against Putin a little bit in the novel as well, don't we? Which is kind of an interesting bit of fun. Was that kind of there from the start, or was that something that came out of the research, or maybe
I'd always wanted to do that, and it was how to thread that in, and how to. I mean, in some ways, what the challenge you have as a spy writer, particularly, is that actually real life spy fact is often far stranger than fiction in many ways, and part of what you're trying to do is almost make reality believable, which is incredibly, which is an odd thing to get. You're often told, especially as a thriller writer, that everything's got to be authentic, but in the espionage genre, what people deem authentic is usually based on how much they know about the secret world. And yeah, no, I mean, some of the things I read and learned were too sort of wacky for to pass that authenticity test, despite the fact they actually happened. But the Putin bit and his role, and the activities of the Stasi as the Cold War sort of wound down, and German reunification, everything that was fascinating. I knew nothing about that before I started the book, and yeah, I couldn't quite believe what I was reading. It was amazing. So I tried, there's not too much of that in there, but there's a bit of it, and the most exciting bits, I think. Yeah,
how long did that take to research, and was that a big part of the process for you? Because as you say, it's kind of threaded into the novel quite lightly, and it doesn't kind of show, that there's that temptation when you do some research to chuck lots of it in. But the novel wears it quite lightly, I think. So was that was a lot of research behind that, just to distill it into the essence that we see in the book?
Yes, I mean, I'd say so. I mean, it's there is so much material on all of this now. When you just have to go on Amazon, and it's just an overwhelming amount of material. I mean, because I write in this genre, which is pretty research heavy, I'm sort of always doing research. I don't tend to do sort of project specific research. It's more just immersing myself in the world. And but the story very much came first, but I saw a chance to put this in as well. And so it came out of years of just reading up about this world, and finding different ways in which to use what I was reading.
Yeah, how about the actual spy craft then? How do you go about kind of researching that, or is that pure imagination? Is there kind of a balance between the two, or is there anything you particularly want to kind of confess to us as we're listening?
No, I mean all of it is real. Actually, it's all. I mean, it's amazing again for a secret world how much open source material there is, and so everything that's in both books, could happen, has happened. Is a sort of tried and tested technique. I mean, the room for sort of authorial imagination is how you deploy all these different bits. If you, I mean, as lots of crime writers know, if you represent a police investigation faithfully, it's one of the most boring things of all time, because it takes months, if not years, and it's mostly paperwork. So what you're trying to do is take the real world example, but then craft it in a way that works for a reader and maintains pace and thrills. And so that's the fun of it. But everything is, you're taking real life and real tradecraft, but then deploying it in a way that's coherent and dramatic, which real tradecraft isn't. I mean, surveillance, for instance, is an incredibly time-consuming and laborious exercise. So it's the sort of antithesis of thriller material. So what you've got to try and do is take the authentic parts of that, but then make it exciting for the reader.
Yeah, so is that done via book research then? And as you say, kind of online research, open source research, or have you actually got contacts that you can speak to help you in
Well, I mean,
shape
I mean,
that?
yeah, I mean, I mean, so having been in Westminster and having worked as a speechwriter and having been immersed in that world, all of that comes from real life experience. And obviously, I mean, this novel is clearly a spy thriller, but actually largely it's also a political thriller. I mean, 3 of the suspects aren't spies, so so yes, all of that comes from lived experience and from having been in that world. And yeah, so it's a mixture of gossip from, you know, Westminster pubs and amazing books I've managed to hunt down which contain some sort of wonderful piece of Cold War tradecraft which might be soon lost, you know, to the mists of time. So it's putting all those things together. And yeah, and then I mean the largest part of it though is stopping it becoming, you know, sort of a non-fiction history, and keeping the story going, keeping the characters interesting. And there's a temptation, particularly with spy fiction, because there's so much rich source material there that you get slightly sort of captivated by that. And you know, in the end, the story is the boss. So it's always trying to get a balance of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just pick up on what you said about the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War is obviously kind of a major sort of aspect of the novel, but it kind of suggests that the Cold War's never ended. There's a really nice quote I like that Solomon is told by his Russian contact that kind of quote, "The tactics change, but the world remains fundamentally the same." Is that maybe kind of a comfort, you think, in a more kind of ever more complicated world where global geopolitics just keeps changing and fragmenting and becoming more difficult to kind of get a grip on? Is kind of Cold War kind of almost like a comfort blanket for us as maybe as readers to when it comes to espionage fiction, do you think?
Well, I mean, certainly it's a comfort perhaps for readers and for writers. I think there was a long period, certainly in the 90s and the noughties, where people seriously questioned the sort of future viability of spy fiction. And I mean, I had this challenge with my first book, which is how do you depict non-state actors, which all terrorist groups are, in a way that's dramatic, in a way that's interesting, and it is extremely difficult. I mean, I hopefully found a satisfying way in that first book, but I think all spy thriller writers have grappled with that. So, and I was writing the first book in sort of 2013, so the world's changed a huge amount since then, and obviously this new Cold War narrative has taken hold again. Russia's sort of antics on the world stage, combined with quite a move away or a shift in perception of China, means that we do now seem to be back to a battle of nation states and quite clear demarcations in terms of sort of ally and opposition. So that is certainly easier to write. And I mean, that's part of the reason why I was able to include more of the Cold War world and Cold War tradecraft in this, because, you know, we've returned to something akin to that. Whereas in the very first book, we very much hadn't really. It was still at a point at which the US was trying to reset relations with Russia, and Number 10 was doing everything possible to usher in an age of a sort of golden period of cooperation with China, and everything from broadband to the whole of business, really. And that's really changed dramatically in the last few years. So that will be fascinating to see how that, you know, if it is the start of a new Cold War in effect, and it's a sort of multi-decade sort of arc, it'll be fascinating to see whether we get a full renaissance of spy thriller writing, which speaks to that, I think, because that if that is going to be the dominant struggle of our time, then that hasn't yet quite been written about, or certainly not in the depth that someone like Le Carré addressed the Cold War. So that could be the next big opening. It's an exciting, or just fascinating geopolitical times.
Yeah, I guess, does that kind of make it difficult as a writer that you're trying to anticipate what's going to happen next, knowing full well that it can take you, a year, 18 months to write a novel, can't it? And and things can dramatically change, can't they? So is there a sense that you can't let the geopolitics drive the novel too much? I guess it comes back to characters, isn't it? Maybe, and it comes back to those kind of conflicts.
Yeah, and I certainly think that again, the British tradition of spy writing, as distinct from the American, tends to focus on character more and individual stories with the sort of geopolitics as background. It's not sort of Tom Clancy and that particular brand of techno thriller. I mean, another one of my heroes, or Frederick Forsyth, used to sort of preempt that worry by setting his novels in the future, which was quite a daring thing to do. So he'd sort of predict what the world would be like in about 4 years' time and write about it then. I don't think I or many others possess his sort of talent and his foresight on that. So yeah, I mean, it's very much character first, story first, but against a real recognizable world, which people, I read spy fiction, lots of spy fiction fans read it because it addresses those big external factors and gets something of the state of the world at the time it's written. That's part of the appeal of the genre. So you've got to have a bit of it in, but it's always got to be character and story first.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about spy fiction more generally, who was your inspirations? I know we touched on Le Carré, haven't we? But who particularly are you reading at the moment? Is there anybody you'd recommend in particular? Because I'm a relatively new kind of convert to spy fiction. It was something I started to pick up in lockdown. I don't know, maybe there was some kind of strange reaction to the world there, but yeah, I'm finding I'm reading an awful lot more of it currently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's all the usual people for me, really. I mean, I started very much with Frederick Forsyth. It's sort of simpler prose style to Le Carré. It's perhaps a bit more, it's very much state of the nation, state of the globe, really. And again, is one of these figures who's part spy thriller writer, part political thriller writer. And with my interest in politics, I always loved that. So then got on to Le Carré. I mean, he is, some books are more famously difficult than others. You need a bit of working at it. I wouldn't recommend something like The Honourable Schoolboy for someone just starting. I mean, there are some easier ones like The Spy Came In From the Cold, or that I would go for first. But if you break through the barriers slightly, I think once you've understood what Le Carré is doing and the way he elevates the thriller really to an art form, it's hard not to become a sort of devotee of him. So yeah, I mean, Le Carré is the Shakespeare of the spy novel, so he's a huge one. But there's some absolutely fantastic modern writers. I mean, Charles Cumming, I think since Le Carré's death, is probably the Britain's greatest living spy writer. Mick Herron, I don't think Mick himself would quite say he's exclusively a spy thriller writer. I think does so many other things as well, and has completely reinvented the spy thriller, if you like. And so, I mean, he's about to go stratospheric with his Apple TV series. So, I mean, but I mean, and Charlotte Filby is another amazing spy writer who's again taking the genre in new directions, and by combining it with the sort of domestic noir side is again changing what the spy novel can be, which is fantastic, and which is how a form survives. I think it's constantly updating, constantly doing new things. And I mean, Robert Harris wouldn't perhaps be thought now of as a spy thriller writer, but there's some absolutely cracking spy thrillers in his back catalogue. I mean, The Ghost, for instance, was arguably the book that made me want to write thrillers, I think. And there's, tons of others that have spies in them and have high-level politics. So yeah, those would be the people I read and enjoy and continue to provide inspiration.
Fantastic. And before we finish up, what's next for Solomon Vine? Will we get more novels featuring Solomon? Because the ending of it kind of sets it up, doesn't it, for a particularly kind of tantalizing option of him carrying forward, I think.
Yes, I mean, what I've always tried to do is sort of create things in a coherent fictional world. So actually the third book is written, it's called The Scarlet Papers, and it's hopefully going to be out next year. It's very different from the first two books. It's much bigger. It spans a much longer time frame. So we go from sort of 1946 Vienna and the post-war world and the hunt for Nazis on the run, all the way up to the present day. And we take in the sort of post-Philby in the 60s, the whole of the Cold War and beyond. So that is yeah, it's a very different book. Vine does have a brief cameo in it, in a bit like Smiley and the Spy Coming from the Cold. He sort of pops up for a scene, but it's a complete standalone. But I've kept Vine going, and who knows, book 4, book 5, book 6, he might come back for a book, I don't know, but it's all the same fictional universe, so you can I can have characters meeting each other from different books and all that sort of thing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Matthew. That's been great to chat. So The Insider is out now, and we'll look forward to the future book next year, Matthew. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Cheers.